In the ashes of the Second World War, countless stories were erased by deliberate silence, buried beneath redacted pages, sealed files, and the quiet complicity of governments desperate to control memory itself. The war was not only fought on battlefields with tanks and rifles, but also in laboratories, interrogation rooms, and forgotten back alleys, where science and cruelty intersected in the name of national survival. In dimly lit archives, beneath layers of dust and censorship, lie fragments of testimonies, requisition orders, and photographs too disturbing for public display. These documents whisper of vanished convoys, of prisoners buried alive in tunnels, of secret handshakes between enemies that condemned the innocent to disappear into the void. The faces of the victims are absent from history books, replaced by numbers, code names, and vague references, but their shadows remain etched into the margins of forgotten reports. Governments traded truth for power, sealing away atrocities in exchange for scientific advantage, territorial claims, or diplomatic stability. Yet every once in a while, a classified file is declassified, a diary is uncovered, or a survivor dares to speak. What emerges is a chilling reminder that the darkest chapters of war are not the battles we remember, but the ones deliberately erased from collective memory. Tonight we unseal 4 such files and stories almost lost forever. Each one is not legend, but history carved in secrecy, wrapped in stamped folders marked top secret, and left to rot in silence. Now their words speak again. Chapter 1. The Orphans of Unit 731. Hidden within the frostbitten wilderness of Manchuria, near the outskirts of Harbin, stood a facility whose name was never meant to be spoken aloud. To its architects, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To the men in black uniforms, it was a fortress of innovation. To its victims, it was simply death. Today, history remembers it under a darker designation, Unit 731. Behind barbed wire, concealed under camouflage netting and armed sentries, lay the most secretive biological warfare complex of the Imperial Japanese Army. Its director, General Shiro Ishii, carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed science existed above morality, sanctioned by the Emperor and shielded by secrecy. In its icy courtyards, orphans, many no older than 10, were brought in under cover of night. They were not prisoners of war, nor even acknowledged by paperwork. They were labeled only with the word maruta, meaning log, as though they were wood to be burned for fuel. To the guards, they were cargo. To the scientists, they were disposable data points in experiments that defied human decency. The first records, now pieced together from fragments of Soviet interrogation files and US military memoranda, describe frostbite chambers where children were forced to stand with bare limbs, exposed to sub-zero winds while researchers poured water over their skin. Soldiers struck their frozen arms with wooden bats, documenting the crack of flesh against bone. When the skin turned black, the scientists noted the exact minute of necrosis. In other rooms, cages of plague-infected fleas were strapped to prisoners' bodies. The infection spread quickly, consuming the frail and malnourished children within days. Entire families vanished into this fortress, yet only the children were targeted for repeated trials, as their small bodies revealed the speed at which disease could cripple the young. The files recovered by Soviet forces in 1945 included detailed charts mapping the spread of bubonic plague through juvenile lungs. Those charts were so precise they later formed the foundation of Cold War-era biological warfare programs in both East and West. It is important to understand the backdrop. Manchuria in 1942 was a land carved into occupation zones. Villages were burned by Japanese patrols. Families fled into forests where starvation and disease stalked them. Orphans, unregistered and invisible, were prime targets for the abductors. Military trucks bearing the insignia of the Kwantung Army arrived at night, seizing the defenseless. No records of adoption, no witnesses, only sudden disappearances. Testimony given years later in Soviet war crime trials describes how children were lured with the promise of food, then driven to the gates of the compound under armed escort. Their parents, if still alive, never saw them again. Officially, the Japanese state denied such transfers. But declassified American intelligence from 1947 reveals the truth. These orphans were considered the ideal subjects, their deaths untraceable, their absence unacknowledged. Inside the compound, Ishii's scientists carried out what they called field effectiveness studies. Children were deliberately infected with anthrax spores and monitored for symptom progression. Those who survived the first wave of disease were injected with untested chemical compounds to measure resistance. When death approached, they were dissected alive without anesthesia, their organs weighed and compared to those of healthy controls. The experiments were catalogued in meticulous handwriting, accompanied by photographs that have never been released to the public. Locked still within government archives under the designation sensitive visual material. Witnesses who later testified at the Khabarovsk war crime trials of 1949 described the smell of burning flesh as corpses were incinerated nightly, their ashes dumped into the nearby Sungari River. The most disturbing detail lies in what followed after Japan's surrender. When Soviet forces captured Harbin in August 1945, they discovered laboratories filled with shattered glassware, hastily burned documents, and steel autopsy tables stained with blood. But the most incriminating material did not remain in Soviet hands. Declassified US Army memoranda from 1947, marked confidential eyes only, confirm that General Ishii and his top staff negotiated immunity in exchange for their research. Operation Paperclip, best known for bringing Nazi scientists to America, extended in secret to Japanese war criminals. The data harvested from orphans, frostbite thresholds, plague incubation periods, chemical lethality curves, was deemed too valuable to destroy. The price of silence was justice itself. The orphans, nameless and voiceless, were erased from official Japanese memory, their fates omitted from post-war trials in Tokyo. The haunting truth is that these children did not simply die. They were converted into numbers. File fragments describe Subject 32, a boy approximately 8 years old, infected with cholera on September 3, 1943. Time to terminal state, 71 hours. Another entry describes Subject 11F, a girl estimated at 12 years, who endured multiple frostbite exposures before succumbing. Amputation results recorded, resistance negligible. Their names are lost. Their families never received confirmation. They exist only as clinical annotations, stripped of humanity by the cold efficiency of military science. The cruelty lies not only in what was done, but in how methodically it was concealed. The Japanese government classified the majority of Unit 731's surviving documents until the 1980s. Even then, only fragments were released, heavily redacted, entire pages blackened. During the Cold War, whispers of Unit 731 spread through intelligence networks. Soviet scientists at Biopreparat quietly acknowledged that their biological warfare advancements drew heavily from Japanese data. American military doctors, working under the cover of Fort Detrick in Maryland, cited unnamed foreign studies when presenting frostbite countermeasures to US troops bound for Korea. The fingerprints of Harbin's atrocities lingered across decades. Invisible, yet undeniable, a chilling irony emerges. The orphans who died nameless in Manchuria became silent contributors to the arsenals of superpowers that once condemned such crimes. Even within Japan, the silence remains deafening. Survivors of surrounding villages reported children vanishing in waves, yet their petitions for acknowledgement were buried under layers of bureaucratic denials. School textbooks omitted any mention. Local officials described missing youth as war casualties. Only the accidental release of photographs in the 1990s, smuggled out of private collections, forced public debate. In those blurred images, emaciated children in tattered clothes stand in snow-lined courtyards, their eyes hollow, their presence a question the government has never answered. Scholars argue whether those photographs depict prisoners or laborers, but the surrounding files leave little doubt. These were the orphans of Unit 731, condemned by circumstance, betrayed by science, erased by politics. The legacy of these children is silence layered upon silence. The Soviet Union recorded their suffering, but only partially, their files lost amid Cold War secrecy. The United States preserved their data, but not their memory. Japan buried their existence altogether. They are victims without graves, ghosts wandering through footnotes and trial transcripts. Each declassified page, each whispered testimony, is a fragment of their stolen existence. What remains is a chilling reminder. History does not erase itself. It is erased by men who decide which truths are too dangerous to be told. And in the icy winds of Manchuria, the cries of those children still echo, carried across decades by documents stamped with a single word: top secret. Chapter 2. The SS Ghost Convoy of Prussia. The winter of 1945 was unlike any other in Europe. Temperatures fell below -20 degrees Celsius, and the Eastern Front collapsed under the relentless pressure of the advancing Red Army. Roads clogged with refugees stretched across East Prussia like veins of desperation, carts and sleds pulled by starving horses, mothers carrying infants wrapped in rags, and Wehrmacht soldiers retreating with whatever remained of their crumbling divisions. Yet, hidden within this tide of human misery, there was one movement that did not resemble the rest. In the frozen nights of January, under the veil of secrecy, an armoured convoy bearing the insignia of the Schutzstaffel rolled out of Königsberg. The column was designated Convoy Schwarzschild, its name appearing in only a handful of surviving Gestapo memoranda, now preserved in fragmentary form within Soviet archives. To villagers along its path, it was not a line of retreating soldiers, but a caravan of shadows, engines muffled, headlights blackened, guarded by men who carried themselves with lethal purpose. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the convoy vanished into the forests near Allenstein, leaving no trace except tire marks in snow and the smell of scorched earth. Contemporary reports mention crates stamped with the Reichsadler, the imperial eagle of the Third Reich, loaded onto trucks under the watchful eyes of SS officers in black greatcoats. These crates were not marked with standard military stencils indicating weapons or rations. Instead, they carried coded numbers that did not correspond to any known supply catalogue. Prisoner testimonies gathered after the war suggest that the cargo contained a mixture of sensitive documents, interrogation files from Gestapo headquarters, and experimental prototypes linked to the Luftwaffe's jet propulsion program. One account, taken from a captured Polish partisan in 1946, described a column of trucks escorted by armed guards, forcing their way through a village road at night, villagers locked inside their homes under threat of execution. He recalled the sound of children crying from one of the covered trucks, though whether they were prisoners or simply illusions conjured by terror remains uncertain. The Red Army's Second Belarusian Front entered Königsberg on April 9, 1945, and found the city in ruins, its archives already stripped bare. The disappearance of the convoy became an immediate priority for the NKVD, who suspected that vital evidence of German war crimes had been removed before their arrival. Soviet field reports recovered decades later describe scorched paths leading into dense woodland, with shallow graves discovered nearby. The bodies, hastily buried, wore civilian clothing, suggesting that local villagers who stumbled upon the convoy had been executed to maintain secrecy. Yet despite extensive searches, no wreckage, no cargo, and no surviving vehicles were recovered. It was as though the convoy had been swallowed by the forest itself. British intelligence soon became aware of the disappearance. Declassified MI6 memoranda from 1952 reference the matter of the Schwarzschild transports, noting that the crates may have contained material relating to German atomic research or early rocketry. The same files hint at a covert agreement between Western intelligence and surviving SS officers, suggesting that portions of the convoy's cargo might have been intercepted and redirected before Soviet forces could reach them. One line, redacted until 1999, reads, "Acquired assets prove valuable to future deterrence strategy." The ambiguity of this phrasing leaves historians questioning whether the assets were documents, technology, or personnel. Regardless, the fate of the convoy itself remains unsolved. Eyewitnesses from East Prussia told stories long dismissed as folklore. Farmers recalled hearing the roar of engines deep within forests at night, followed by the crack of gunfire. Others swore they saw faint fires flickering among the trees, only to find the snow unmarked by tracks the next morning. Some spoke of a lake near the village of Jeziorany, its surface frozen solid that winter. Decades later, divers reported twisted metal shapes submerged in the depths, though no official recovery effort has ever been sanctioned. Each rumor adds to the legend, yet none provide definitive proof. The convoy remains an open wound in the historical record, an event acknowledged in whispers by both Allied and Soviet agencies, but never publicly admitted. The most chilling implication of the missing convoy lies in what it may have carried. Among the destroyed Gestapo files recovered from Königsberg was a partially burned index page referencing file number 17B, labeled Endlösung Sonderprotokolle. Historians interpret this as final solution special protocols, possibly containing interrogation transcripts from Auschwitz and other camps. If such records were indeed loaded onto the trucks, their disappearance may have been deliberate, ensuring that certain individuals escaped post-war accountability. The destruction of evidence was a priority for the SS during the war's final months, and the Ghost Convoy of Prussia may represent one of the most successful of these efforts. For decades, East German citizens were warned never to speak of the convoy. The Stasi monitored discussions about it, treating the subject as subversive rumor. Meanwhile, Western intelligence kept the files buried, citing national security. By the time fragments emerged in the 1990s, the eyewitnesses were frail, their memories dimmed by age and fear. Yet they all repeated one consistent detail. The convoy's passage was accompanied by silence, as if even the forest held its breath. The Ghost Convoy stands today as a symbol of erasure, not only of the missing men who drove those trucks, but of the truths buried with them. Its disappearance reflects a war fought not just with bullets and tanks, but with information, secrets, and deliberate obfuscation. Somewhere in the snow-choked forests of East Prussia, under the soil or beneath dark waters, lies a piece of history that governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain decided the world was not ready to see. And as long as those crates remain hidden, the ghosts of Convoy Schwarzschild will continue to haunt the silence of the archives. Chapter 3: Operation Trident's Forgotten Prisoners. In the summer of 1943, while Allied leaders converged in Casablanca to plot the defeat of Hitler's Europe, another operation was quietly taking shape far from the public stage. Its designation, buried in the OSS archives, was Operation Trident. Unlike the conference that bore the same name, this Trident was no grand diplomatic maneuver. It was a clandestine mission designed to intercept Axis defectors, double agents, and political dissidents in the volatile Balkans. The OSS, working alongside British Special Operations executive units, identified the Adriatic island of Vis as a strategic holding site, chosen for its isolation and the ease with which it could be controlled. What was meant to be a temporary detention point became, in reality, a subterranean prison for men and women who never reappeared in official records. They were neither prisoners of war nor civilian internees. They were something else entirely. Individuals classified in secret memoranda as unregistered combatants. Stripped of identity, they entered the tunnels beneath Vis and never returned. The official purpose of Operation Trident, according to declassified fragments, was to secure intelligence from Yugoslav partisans and suspected Axis collaborators before they could shift allegiances. But the mission quickly devolved into a shadow war, one where ideology blurred with opportunism. The British SOE maintained surface-level camps on the island, documented in military logs, while the OSS managed subterranean facilities sealed off from the outside world. Reports from 1943 reference construction materials diverted from Naples, suggesting reinforced bunkers with steel doors and ventilation shafts sunk into limestone. Eyewitness accounts from local fishermen later testified to hearing faint echoes of machinery beneath the cliffs, long after the supposed camps had been abandoned. These were not ordinary prisons. They were laboratories of interrogation, where men and women vanished into silence. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from a diary discovered in Belgrade in 1978, belonging to a Yugoslav resistance fighter identified only as MD. His entries describe being captured by Allied operatives near Split and ferried under cover of night to an island he believed was Vis. There, he was stripped of identification and held in a dark cell with a handful of others. He wrote of rations so meager that starvation became routine, of guards speaking English with American accents, and of a constant chemical smell that seeped through the ventilation shafts. His final entry, dated November 12, 1943, reads, "They come at night with syringes. We no longer resist." After this, the diary ends. Soviet intelligence later cited the document in a classified 1961 report on Western war crimes, but the original copy vanished into Cold War archives. Testimonies gathered after the war indicate that prisoners on Vis were subjected to experimental drugs, amphetamines designed to test endurance, sedatives used to break resistance, and truth serums trialed before they were ever formally introduced in intelligence operations. These crude experiments foreshadowed later programs such as MKUltra, which would plague the Cold War with its secret abuses. The island's subterranean bunkers, cut into the limestone cliffs, provided the perfect containment. Prisoners were denied sunlight, chained in damp chambers where salt air corroded metal and stone alike. Guards reported that hallucinations were common, exacerbated by isolation and malnutrition. The prisoners became test subjects in a war that blurred the line between interrogation and experimentation. What makes Operation Trident particularly disturbing is the deliberate absence of documentation. Unlike Nazi concentration camps, whose horrific scale left undeniable evidence, the Trident facilities were designed to leave nothing behind. Prisoners were never logged. Their names were erased the moment they entered the tunnels. In British reports, these individuals were labelled unregistered combatants, a phrase that effectively removed them from the Geneva Conventions. To Allied command, they did not exist. When operations on Vis were concluded, demolition charges sealed the tunnels. The official record states that the island was abandoned in 1944, but classified British cables discovered decades later contradict this. A memo marked London Eyes Only records the destruction of facilities with the phrase, "No retrieval, no survivors." The wording leaves little ambiguity. Whatever remained inside those tunnels, bodies, documents, or evidence of experimentation, was deliberately buried beneath tons of rock. The betrayal of these forgotten prisoners is compounded by the silence that followed. Families in Yugoslavia, Greece, and even Italy filed petitions for missing relatives who vanished during 1943 and 1944. None were acknowledged. Allied governments deflected inquiries, citing the chaos of war. The truth was buried deeper than the tunnels themselves. The missing were absorbed into lists of presumed wartime dead, their disappearances explained away as casualties of Axis reprisals. But the few documents that escaped redaction point to something more sinister. The deliberate erasure of witnesses whose knowledge, loyalties, or mere existence posed risks to the fragile balance of Allied power. The OSS itself dissolved in 1945, replaced by the Central Intelligence Agency. Yet, within the CIA's early files lie references to legacy Trident assets. Historians argue this phrase likely refers to the data gathered from the Vis. Prisoners, crude but valuable studies of psychological, resistance and drug responses. If true, then the prisoners who perished beneath Vis did not simply vanish. They became unwilling contributors to the intelligence playbook of the Cold War. The irony is bitter. Men and women who fought against tyranny, or who sought to defect from it, became victims of the very forces they believed would liberate Europe. Local legends on Vis still speak of the tunnels. Fishermen tell stories of strange drafts that escape from cracks in the cliffs, carrying with them the faint smell of chemicals. Divers exploring the coast claim to have found rusted steel doors beneath the waterline, long since sealed by landslides. When questioned, authorities dismiss these accounts as folklore. Yet fragments of military maps suggest otherwise, marking areas of the island as restricted long after the war had ended. The silence of governments only fuels the suspicion that something dark remains entombed there. Operation Trident's prisoners remain unacknowledged in official history. They have no memorials, no grave markers, no recognition in the archives of nations that once claimed to fight for freedom. Their suffering exists only in the margins, a diary entry in Belgrade, a redacted cable in London, a whispered testimony in Moscow. They were erased by design, denied even the dignity of being remembered as casualties of war. And yet, in the gaps of history, their presence lingers. They remind us that victory is not always clean, and that even the so-called liberators were capable of crimes best left unspoken. The tunnels of Vis remain sealed, but the silence that covers them is breaking. With each declassified file, each uncovered testimony, the forgotten prisoners of Operation Trident edge closer to the recognition they were denied. Their voices, once silenced by stone, now echo through history's unsealed archives, demanding to be heard. Chapter 4: Stalin's Hidden Pact of Repatriation. The guns of Europe had fallen silent in May 1945, but the peace that followed carried shadows darker than the war itself. In the weeks after the Reichstag burned and Berlin lay in ruins, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin moved swiftly to enforce an agreement shrouded in secrecy. The directive, later identified in declassified Soviet memoranda as Operation Keelhaul, was not signed in public halls or recorded in Allied communiques. It was carried out in the dead of night, with trains and trucks, guarded by soldiers who followed orders without questions. Under this hidden pact of repatriation, thousands of men, women, and children, Cossacks, White Russian émigrés, and even Soviet prisoners of war who had fought under German command, were forced back into the waiting arms of the NKVD. To the Western Allies, The transfers were presented as routine, a technical fulfillment of wartime agreements. To those who boarded the cattle cars believing they were bound for safety, it was a betrayal of unimaginable cruelty. The origins of this pact can be traced to the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Behind closed doors, amid discussions of post-war borders and the fate of Eastern Europe, Stalin demanded the return of all Soviet citizens, regardless of the circumstances under which they had left the motherland. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, desperate to maintain Soviet cooperation against Japan and to preserve fragile post-war unity, conceded. The deal was never intended for public disclosure. The language used in Foreign Office memoranda was carefully sanitized, speaking only of repatriation. But the men and women who faced Soviet trains knew that repatriation meant only one thing: death or life in the Gulag. Eyewitness accounts reveal the brutality of the transfers. In Austria's Drautal Valley, in late May 1945, British soldiers surrounded camps of surrendered Cossack families who had fled westward to escape Stalin's vengeance. They were told they would be transported to Italy for resettlement. Instead, trucks carried them to Soviet checkpoints where NKVD officers awaited. Declassified War Office files describe disorderly scenes, but survivor testimonies expose the horror more clearly. Families clung to one another, priests led desperate prayers, and when the truth became undeniable, mass suicides erupted. Mothers threw themselves with their children into the icy Drava River rather than be handed over. British officers recorded these events in personal diaries, their words stained with guilt, yet the official reports reduced it to regrettable unrest. The scale of Operation Keelhaul was immense. Estimates vary, but between 1.5 and 2 million individuals were forcibly returned to the Soviet Union from territories liberated by the Allies. Many were not Soviet citizens at all. White Russians who had fled decades earlier during the revolution, émigrés who had never set foot in Stalin's Soviet Union, were swept up in the broad definition of repatriates. Once delivered, they vanished into the maw of the Gulag system: Vorkuta, Kolyma, Magadan, camps synonymous with starvation, forced labor, and endless winter. Declassified NKVD transport manifests describe human cargo in clinical detail, noting numbers but never names. The individuals disappeared into rows of statistics, their existence reduced to tally marks in a bureaucratic nightmare. Western complicity in the Pact remained hidden for decades. In 1946, internal memoranda of the British Foreign Office classified the repatriations as politically sensitive, ensuring public discussion was silenced. American military archives carried similar redactions, burying references to forced returns under bland phrases like population transfers. Yet, among those who carried out the orders, the memories could not be erased. A British officer stationed in Austria wrote in his personal journal, "We marched them with bayonets fixed. Their eyes never left ours. They knew we were sending them to their deaths." His words, unpublished until the 1970s, reveal the quiet torment felt by soldiers who had been ordered to betray those who trusted them. The betrayal stretched even to prisoners of war. Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans and later liberated by the Allies were classified as traitors upon return. Stalin had declared in 1941 that any Red Army soldier who surrendered was guilty of treason. Thus, even men who had endured years in German camps, emaciated and broken, were shipped back east only to face execution or deportation. For them, liberation was merely a pause before condemnation. Files recovered from Soviet archives in the 1990s reveal interrogation records where returned POWs were accused of collaboration regardless of evidence. Entire trainloads of skeletal men were delivered straight from Allied custody into NKVD processing centers, never to be seen again. The secrecy of Operation Keelhaul endured throughout the Cold War. In Britain, Parliament was never informed. In the United States, public acknowledgement was avoided entirely. Families of émigrés petitioned for information, only to be told their relatives were untraceable. Meanwhile, Western leaders spoke publicly of freedom, democracy, and human rights, even as they concealed their complicity in Stalin's demands. The silence was maintained not just by redacted files, but by deliberate omission from historical narratives. Schoolbooks, official histories, and commemorations of victory excluded the story altogether. The victims became a void in memory, their cries drowned beneath celebrations of peace. Even decades later, the traces of Operation Keelhaul remain unsettling. Survivors who escaped recount nights filled with screams as trains departed Austrian valleys, carrying their loved ones eastward. In Russia, descendants of those repatriated still search for records of family members who disappeared into camps. In the West, declassified documents continue to emerge, each one peeling back a layer of secrecy. A 1947 cable marked Eyes Only from the British Embassy in Moscow contains a chilling admission. We are aware of their fate. Disclosure would compromise the unity achieved. That unity, forged in deception, cost millions their lives and erased entire communities from history. The hidden pact reveals the cold calculus of wartime diplomacy. For Roosevelt and Churchill, sacrificing émigrés and prisoners was the price of Stalin's cooperation. For Stalin, it was a chance to purge dissent and tighten his grip on power. For the victims, it was a betrayal beyond comprehension. They believed they had escaped tyranny by surrendering to Allied forces. Instead, they were delivered into the hands of the very regime they had fled. Their last sight of the West was not freedom, but Allied bayonets urging them towards sealed trains. Their last hope was extinguished under orders signed in secret, hidden from the world. Operation Keelhaul remains one of the least acknowledged crimes of the 20th century. It was not committed in battle, nor in defiance of international law, but under the guise of legality, sealed by diplomatic handshakes. Its victims are not honored in monuments or remembered in ceremonies. They exist only in the scattered testimonies of survivors, in faded petitions, in diaries smuggled across borders. The rest remain buried in files once stamped strictly confidential, and in unmarked graves scattered across Siberia. Stalin's hidden pact was not merely an act of repatriation. It was an act of erasure, of lives, of memory, of justice itself. And as long as silence surrounds it, the betrayal continues to echo in the shadows of victory. The war's most haunting truths are never the ones etched into monuments or replayed in newsreels. They are the ones buried in sealed files, redacted memoranda, and the whispered confessions of men who carried out orders they dared not record. The children of Unit 731, stripped of names and reduced to numbers, remind us that science in the wrong hands can become a weapon more brutal than any bomb. The missing convoy in the forests of East Prussia stands as a symbol of secrets deliberately vanished, its cargo of knowledge and death still casting shadows over history. The prisoners of Operation Trident, sealed into tunnels on Vis and erased from every ledger, show us how victory can mask betrayal. And the human tide swept away by Stalin's hidden pact of repatriation proves that even in peace, entire populations could be condemned in silence. These stories are fragments of a larger pattern, truths bartered, suppressed, and hidden by those who feared what their exposure would reveal. Each file declassified, each testimony uncovered, brings us closer to understanding the full cost of a war remembered selectively. Yet, for every detail that surfaces, more questions remain unanswered. Where are the graves? Where are the missing files? How many lives were erased not by bullets, but by deliberate silence? The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. History's most disturbing chapters were not lost by accident. They were buried on purpose, and the ghosts of that silence still wait for us in the archives we have yet to open.